A shaded light in an alcove at the head of the stairs threw a dim light down the passage which led off the first-floor landing, but Musard felt for the electric switch and pressed it. The light flooded an empty corridor, with the door of the room nearest to him gaping into a dark interior. Musard stepped inside the open door, struck a match to find the switch, and walked over and turned on the light. As he did so, Phil and his father reached the door and followed him into the room, where, less than 2 hours before, Miss Herodotus had been with Phil's young wife, and left her to sleep. The room seemed as it had been then. There was no sign of any intruder. The cut glass and silver bottles stood on the small table by the head of the bed, the gold cigarette case was open alongside them, a novel, flung face downward on the pillows, revealed a garish cover and the bold lettering of the title, What Shall It Profit? As though the book had dropped from the hand of someone overcome by sleep. But the white rays of the electric globe, hanging in a shade of rose color directly overhead, fell with sinister distinctness on the slender figure of the young wife, lying in a huddled heap on the bed, her fashionable rest gown stained with blood, which oozed from her breast in a sluggish stream on the satin quilt. A sharp, pungent odor was mingled with the heavy atmosphere of the room, the smell of a burning fabric. There was no disorder, no weapon, no indication of a struggle. Only the motionless, bleeding figure on the bed revealed to the guests clustering outside the room that somebody had entered and departed as silently as a tiger. Musard went swiftly to the bedside and bent over the girl. "She has been shot," he said, in a tone which was little more than a whisper. "She has been murdered." It was Phil, pressing close behind Musard, who uttered these words. "Murdered," he cried, in an unnatural voice, which was dreadful to hear. He made a few steps in the direction of the bed with his arms outstretched, then stopped, and, swinging round, faced the guests who were thronging the corridor outside. "Murdered, I say," he repeated. "Where is the murderer?" He stood for a moment, fixing a wild eye on the group of frightened faces in the doorway, as though seeking the murderer among them. Then his face became distorted, and he fell to the ground. His limbs seemed to grow rigid as he lay, his legs were extended stiffly, the upper part of his arms were pressed against his breast, but the forearms inclined forward, with the palms of the hand thrown back, and the fingers wide apart. Even in his unconsciousness he looked as though he were warding off the horror of the sight which had stricken him to the ground. In the presence of domestic calamity human nature betrays its inherent weakness. At such times the artificial outer covering of civilization falls away, and the soul stands forth, stark, primitive, forlorn, and cries aloud. The strain of the tremendous tragedy which had entered his house, swift-footed and silent, was too much for Sir Philip. He sank on his knees by the side of his unconscious son, whimpering like a child, a weak and helpless old man. There was no trace of the dignity of the Herodotus or pride of race in the wrinkled face, now distorted with the pitiful grin of senility, as Sir Philip crouched over his son, stroking his face with feeble fingers. One or two of the women in the passage became hysterical. The young men looked on awkwardly, with grave faces, not knowing what to do. There was something very English in their shy aloofness, in their dislike of intruding in the room unasked. Musard, looking round from the bedside, glanced briefly at the prostrate figure of Phil, and then his gleaming eyes traveled to the group at the doorway. He, at all events, was calm and master of himself. "The ladies had better go downstairs," he said, speaking in a subdued voice, but with decision. "They can do no good here. And will you he singled out two of the young men with his eye, carry Phil downstairs? He has only fainted. Please take Sir Philip away also. Telephone for Dr. Holmes immediately, and send for Sergeant Lum. And some of you young men search the house thoroughly, at once. No, not this room. Search the house from top to bottom, and the grounds outside. Be quick. There is no time to be lost." The group in the doorway melted away. The ladies, pale-faced and weeping, went downstairs together like a flock of frightened birds, and the young men, only too glad to obey somebody who showed nerve and resolution at such a moment, dispersed at once to search the house. Musard was left in the room alone, but not for long. Miss Herodotus entered from the corridor almost immediately. Tufnell accompanied her to the door, but stopped there, with staring eyes directed towards the bed. Miss Herodotus's face was drawn, but she had recovered her self-control. She walked quickly towards Musard, who was still bending over the bed. "Vincent," she cried. "In pity's name tell me what dreadful thing has happened?" "They have carried Phil downstairs, and they tried to detain me, but I broke away from them and came straight to you." "Is Violet?" Musard sprang to his feet at the first sound of her voice, and wheeled round swiftly, as if trying to impose his body between her and the figure on the bed. "Go back, Alethea," he sternly commanded. "Go back, I say. This is no sight for you, and you can do no good." He still sought to intercept her as she approached, but she gently put aside his detaining hand, and, walking to the bedside, looked down. Then, at that sight, her fingers sought for his with an impulsive feminine movement, and held them tight. "Do not be afraid for me," she whispered. "See? I am calm, I may be able to help." "Is she dead?" "Dying," said Musard sadly. "Is it?" Her voice dropped to nothingness, but her frightened eyes, traveling fearfully into the shadowy corners of the big bedroom, completed the unspoken sentence. Musard understood her, and bowed his head silently. Then, turning his face to the door, he beckoned Tufnell to approach. The old servant advanced tremblingly into the room, vainly endeavoring to compose his horror-stricken face into a semblance of the impassive mask of the well-trained English servant. "Go downstairs and get me some hot water," said Musard quietly. "Look sharp and bring it yourself. I do not want any maidservants here to go into hysterics." Tufnell hastened away. Musard resumed his place at the bedside, silently watching the figure on the bed. There was blood on his hands and clothes. "Is there no hope? Can nothing be done to save her?" whispered Miss Herodotus. "Nothing. The lung is penetrated. She is bleeding to death." His quick eye noticed a change in the figure on the bed. The face quivered ever so slightly, and the blue eyes half opened. Then the stricken girl made an effort as though she wanted to sit up, but a sudden convulsion seized her, and she fell back on her pillow, with one little white hand, glittering with rings, flung above her head, as if she died in the act of invoking the retribution of a god of justice on the assassin who had blotted out her young life in agony and horror. "She is dead," said Musard gently. "This is a terrible business, and our first duty is to try and capture the monster who committed this foul crime." They stood there in silence for a moment, looking earnestly at one another. Outside, somewhere in the woodland, there sounded the haunting gush of a nightbird's song, shivering through the quietness like a silver bell. The sweet note finished in a frightened squawk, and was followed by the cry of an owl. The song had betrayed the singer. Musard turned away from Miss Herodotus, and walked restlessly around the bedroom, scanning the heavy pieces of furniture and the faded hangings, and peering into every nook and corner, as if seeking for the murderer's place of concealment. A roomy old wardrobe near the window attracted his eye, and he stopped in front of it and flung its doors open. It contained some articles of the dead girl's apparel, costumes and frocks, hanging on hooks. His eye wandered to the window, shrouded in the heavy folds of the damask curtains. He walked over to it, and drew the curtains aside. The bottom half of the window was wide open. Miss Herodotus, who was following his movements closely, gave vent to a faint cry of surprise. "The window!" she exclaimed. Musard looked round inquiringly. "The window, what of it?" he asked. It was closed when I came in here before dinner to see Violet. You are quite sure of that? Oh, yes. At least, I think so. I do not understand you. I mean that the atmosphere of the room was heavy and thick, as if the window had not been opened all day. It has been a still, close day. But Violet never had a window open if she could help it. She disliked fresh air. She was always afraid of catching cold. Musard looked out of the window into the velvet darkness of the night. If the window was closed before, the murderer has opened it and escaped through it, he said. It is hardly possible. Why not? He turned round and faced her. The ground falls on that side. The window is nearly 20 feet from the ground. And there is the moat to be crossed. There is no bridge on that side of the house, and this window opens on the garden. Don't you remember? I remember now. I thought you would. Still, Musard broke off abruptly, and walked away from the window. Near the window stood the dressing table. The swing-oval mirror reflected its contents: ivory brushes, silver hand mirrors, all the costly bijouterie of a refined woman's toilet. Among them stood Violet's silver jewel case. Musard strode over and examined the case. It was locked. This ought to be put away, he said. I was coming up to get it when I heard the scream, whispered his companion. Perhaps you will take charge of it now, he said, placing it in her hands. As he did so, there flashed across his mind the cynical appropriateness of the old proverb about locking doors after stolen steeds. There was a restraint and lack of spontaneity about their conversation of which both were acutely conscious. The note was forced, as though from too great an effort to strike the right key. A curious psychological change had swept over both since they stood together by the bedside of the dying woman. It had come with the entry of death. They conversed hurriedly and guardedly, as if they mistrusted each other. In each of them two entities were now apparent: a surface consciousness, which talked and acted mechanically, and a secondary inner consciousness, watchful, and fearful of misinterpretation of the spoken word. The faculties which make up the human mind are different and complex, and mysteriously blended. It may be that when tragedy upsets the frail structure of human life, the brute instincts of watchfulness and self-preservation come uppermost, guarding against chance suspicion, or the loud word of accusation. Perhaps through Musard's mind was passing the thought of the strange manner in which the murder had been committed, and how he, by detaining everybody downstairs at the dinner table while he told his story, had been an instrument in its accomplishment. The situation was terminated by the arrival of Tufnell with some hot water. Almost on his heels came the young men who had been searching the house. Musard was relieved by their return, though his impassive face did not reveal his feelings. Miss Herodotus left the room with Tufnell, taking the jewel case with her. Musard met the young men at the threshold. The tall young officer with the sunburnt face, Major Gardner, informed Musard that they had completed a search of the house from top to bottom, but had found nothing. They had also searched the grounds, without result. Mrs. Herodotus is dead, Musard gravely informed them. She died while you have been searching for the miscreant who fired the shot we heard at the dinner table. Gentlemen, he must be found. It seems hardly possible that he has succeeded in getting clear away in so short a time. We have searched the place from top to bottom, remarked one of the young men. It is a strange, rambling old place, and difficult to explore unless you know it thoroughly, said Musard. We have done the best we could. I do not doubt it, but there are many old nooks and corners in which a man might hide. His first thought, after such a dreadful crime, would be to get away as quickly as possible, said Major Gardner. But how did he escape? Certainly not by the staircase, because we rushed out from the dining room directly we heard the shot, and we should have caught him on his way down. Is there not a window in the bedroom? Could he not have escaped that way? The window is nearly 20 feet from the ground. An athletic man might jump that distance, remarked Major Gardner thoughtfully. I still think it possible he may be concealed about the premises, replied Musard. There is an old and used staircase at the end of this passage, which opens on the south side of the moat house. Did you find it? It shuts with a door at the top, and might easily have escaped your notice. I opened the door and went down the staircase, said the young flying officer. Nobody could have escaped that way. The door at the bottom is locked, and there is no key. The scared face of a maidservant at that moment appeared at the head of the stairs. If you please, sir, she said, addressing Musard, one of the gentlemen downstairs sent me up to tell you that he has been trying for the last 10 minutes to ring up the police, but he can't get an answer. Send the butler to me at once. The maid disappeared, and in another moment the butler came hurriedly up the stairs. Tufnell, said Musard quickly, you must go at once to the village and get Sergeant Lum and Dr. Holmes. Hurry off, and be as quick as you can. And now, gentlemen, he added, turning to the others, let us go downstairs. While we are waiting for the police, I will help you make another search of the house and grounds. The murderer may escape while we stand here talking. We have wasted too much valuable time already.